Are microtransactions optional? Are loot boxes addictive? The short answers are no and yes, respectively. What's up guys, Thorn here and welcome to another video game discussion video. I do these discussion videos on a regular basis, so if you'd like to see more of them, hit that subscribe button to stay notified. Now, notice exactly how I phrased the question just now. I did not ask, are loot boxes gambling? I asked if they were addictive, and that is an important distinction to make, because by most countries' legal definitions of the term, no, they are not gambling per se, but neither are drugs, alcohol, or tobacco, yet it is common knowledge that they are also addictive. With that said, we should also try to clearly define what it means for a microtransaction to be optional. If we define optional in the sense that nobody is forced, as in physically forced with threats or coercion, to buy microtransactions, then perhaps the video game publishers who put microtransactions in their game are technically telling the truth when they say it is optional. But let me put an asterisk on that concession, because I will be coming back to it later when I talk about loot boxes. For the time being, however, if we go by that definition, then it would be a completely redundant standard. Of course we aren't being forced under duress to buy these microtransactions. Then again, we aren't exactly being forced to buy the game the microtransactions are for in the first place. Clearly, when corporate executives defend their microtransactions as being optional, they have to mean something other than just pure physical force. The next most obvious definition of optional is that you can unlock everything in the game via normal gameplay without having to buy a single microtransaction. This is the definition I will be focusing on today. However, even according to this liberal definition, I would argue that calling microtransactions optional is still a bald-faced lie, and by watching this video, I hope you can see what I mean. Now, you've already heard the argument a million times before that video games with microtransactions in them are heavily unbalanced and heavily focused on grindfests in order to make microtransactions the only feasible option. That's already been said a million times before, and there is very little I can say that would bring anything new to the table. However, it's still something I need to address, because apparently AAA publishers can't seem to get it through their thick fucking skulls. Video games are being intentionally scaled back to make room for microtransaction content. Now, some of you might reasonably ask, why is that a bad thing? Well, think about how the video game industry has behaved up until microtransactions came out. For decades, video games only went in one direction, forward. The shooter genre went from this, to this, to this, to this. The platformer genre went from this, to this, to this, to this. Then the current generation of video game consoles came along, and suddenly video games were going in reverse order. Suddenly, we are starting to experience a shrinkage of video game content and scope rather than a growth of it. Nowadays, the content we get out of the box without having to buy microtransactions is on par with the amount of content we previously got from a game demo. And demos used to be free! Yeah, it's starting to feel like we have to buy the demo and then pay extra through the nose for the whole game. Now, I understand that this is a mostly sentimental argument, so how about an argument that's a bit more objective? Sometimes content can only be acquired through microtransactions, and there is simply no way around it. Take FIFA, for example. Now, I am not a soccer fan, so everything I am about to say about this franchise is hearsay. However, if anything I say about the franchise is objectively inaccurate, please post a comment correcting me. Anyway, their online multiplayer content has a feature in it called Ultimate Team, where you can collect only the absolute best soccer players in the game to put into one single team in order to get an advantage against other online players. However, each player can only be unlocked for use in the Ultimate Team mode if you get lucky enough to get one of them in a loot box microtransaction. This is one instance where the microtransactions, nay, the loot boxes, are not the least bit optional. You absolutely must use the loot boxes, and only the loot boxes, or else you are actively missing out on the content the game developers very clearly wanted you to experience. From what I have read about this series, no amount of grinding can get you the best characters for your Ultimate Team. You absolutely have to spend extra money to get it, and that's simply all there is to it. Now, some of you, those of you who already work for EA's upper management to begin with, will probably counter-argue that the Ultimate Team mode is itself an entirely optional portion of the whole game. Well, if we take that argument and continue to its logical conclusion, then who is to say what exactly is optional as opposed to essential? Couldn't nearly anything in the game be considered optional in relation to the rest of the game? By that logic, you could lock almost everything in the game behind microtransaction paywalls, except the absolute bare minimum amount of content necessary to let people actually get past the main menu, and argue that it's okay to require microtransactions for everything else because it's just optional. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at a video game franchise that I am quite familiar with, the WWE 2K series. As of the time of this running, the WWE games have 6 main gameplay modes: Exhibition, aka Play, Towers, Universe, My Career, Showcase, and of course, online multiplayer. The most recent game in the franchise, WWE 2K19, has over 200 wrestlers to play as, more than 100 of which are available right out of the box without even needing to be unlocked, 48 arenas to fight in, and 75 different match types that we can have. And all of that isn't even counting the extremely robust creation suite that allows us to create practically any wrestler or arena, real or fiction, we want. We also have a 12-hour story mode in My Career, additional story content in the Daniel Bryan Showcase, and daily challenges with unique stipulations to the matches in 2K Towers mode. I only bought the base version of WWE 2K19, and I definitely got my $60 worth. I don't need the deluxe edition or the season pass. My $60 got me plenty of content, thank you! Now imagine if 2K were to release a wrestling game that had this much content, but most of it was classified by the publisher as optional and therefore was locked behind microtransactions. Imagine if the only content we could experience out of the box was just one mode, Exhibition mode. Only one match type, one-on-one normal match, and only one arena and only 2 wrestlers. So only one match could ever be played over and over and over again, just the same match with no variation whatsoever. That was literally all you got for your $60 entry fee. Absolutely everything else was locked behind a microtransaction. You want to unlock another wrestler to play as? 99 cents per wrestler. You want to unlock another arena to play in? 99 cents per arena. You want to create a wrestler so you can bypass the low roster? 99 cents per wrestler created. You want to unlock and play the My Career, Showcase, or Towers mode? That'll be an extra $9.99 per mode unlocked. But hey, all of that is just optional content, right? You can still get a full AAA experience without them, right? I don't think the out-of-the-box content is insufficient to justify a $60 price tag. I think you're just all a bunch of self-entitled gits who always demand more from the developers than what they can put out, but you're not willing to actually pay what it's worth. Are you starting to see the problem here? There is no such thing as content being optional in a game to the point where requiring microtransactions to unlock them could likewise be seen as optional. Now, all of that is assuming the absolute best case scenario. All of that is giving the publishers every reasonable benefit of the doubt. But remember earlier, when I talked about how players are not being physically forced per se to purchase microtransactions? And I said I was putting an asterisk on that statement? Well, let's talk about that asterisk, shall we? Even by the strictest definition of what constitutes optional, microtransactions can only claim to meet that standard if they are consistently presented as voluntary, mature, informed purchases, where the buyer knows full well how much he is spending, knows what he is getting in exchange for that spending, and is fully capable of simply walking away if he wants to. However, there are literally hundreds of cases that pop up each and every week where one or more of these criteria simply are not being met. There is documented case after documented case of children and or mentally handicapped individuals charging their parents' credit cards into bankruptcy over video game microtransactions because they don't realize that performing these button inputs will cause their parents to have to spend money. This causes their parents to rack up absolutely insane bills, and their children don't even realize what they've done until it's too late. These aren't bad kids either. This isn't simply a case of an untrustworthy kid not being given enough supervision by their deadbeat parents. These are good kids. Kids who mean well. Kids who normally can be trusted to follow their parents' rules with only minimal supervision, and who are genuinely sorry for what they did once they realize it. The problem here isn't with the kids or the parents. The problem is with the games making it far too easy to mentally divorce the act of spending real money from the act of acquiring in-game content. It is far too easy for people, especially children, to make these purchases without realizing they actually cost money. That alone causes these microtransactions to go from optional to involuntary, because a purchase is not voluntary unless both parties understand the terms of the purchase. I have some prior experience as a paralegal, and I can tell you from personal experience that contract law even has an official term for this requirement. It's called a meeting of the minds. Put simply, a contract is null and void if there is no meeting of the minds. And in the case of children racking up large bills for their parents by unwittingly purchasing microtransactions, there is no meeting of the minds. Therefore, the purchases are not optional. But even among adults, microtransactions, and especially loot boxes, all too often fail miserably to clear the bar for being classified as optional, even when the bar is set at its lowest peg. You know why? Because microtransactions, and especially loot boxes, are now scientifically proven to be just as addictive as gambling. Now, I understand that video game loot boxes and microtransactions do not currently fit the legal definition of gambling in most first world countries. However, maybe the problem isn't with the legal definition of gambling. Maybe the problem is with us. Maybe the problem is with us constantly insisting that video game loot boxes should be classified as gambling, and therefore we're losing sight of the real problem here. We accuse AAA publishers of arguing over semantics to get around gambling regulations, but maybe we're the ones who are obsessing too much over semantics. Are loot boxes gambling per se? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Are they addictive? Yes they are, and that's the only thing I care about. Instead of trying to force loot boxes into the gambling category, why don't we instead just put them in the I don't give a shit what category they go into because they're addictive all the same category, and then work from there. Hell, create an entirely new government agency from the ground up to oversee these mechanics if you have to. Now, what does all this have to do with the thesis of this video? The focus of this video isn't meant to discuss whether microtransactions are addictive, it's supposed to discuss whether they're optional. Except, that's just it. Because they are now scientifically proven to be addictive regardless of what category you put them in for administrative purposes, that means that those who suffer from these addictions do not have the option of simply not buying the loot boxes. That's how addictions work. If you're an addict, you don't continue your addictive behavior because you don't want to stop. You continue your addictive behavior because you literally cannot stop. That's what separates a bona fide addiction from just a really fun hobby, like a really fun video game. The very definition of an addiction is that the associated behavior is compulsory. Compulsory, as in compelled. You are compelled to do it. And the saddest part is, I shouldn't even have to tell you that, because 99.99% of you already directly witnessed what I'm talking about firsthand at some point in your life. Specifically, I'm talking about smokers, one of the few types of addictive behavior that is socially acceptable despite its addictive nature being common knowledge. I guarantee you that every single one of you watching this video have had at least one friend or family member who has tried to quit smoking and may or may not have succeeded in quitting. Some of you may have even been that friend or family member who tried to quit smoking. However, even for those of you who successfully quit smoking, you all know from personal experience that you don't just walk away from cigarettes. You don't just wake up one day and decide, I'm not going to smoke anymore. Along that same vein, now that video game loot boxes are scientifically proven to be addictive, that means that those who suffer from this addiction cannot stop buying them even if they wanted to. I don't know how much simpler I can put this. The only way they could possibly stop buying the loot boxes is if their physical ability to buy them was taken from them, such as their bank account having insufficient funds to buy more loot boxes, or if the games themselves that have the loot boxes in them are physically taken away. AAA game publishers try to defend their loot boxes and microtransactions by claiming that, rather than comparing their loot boxes to gambling, perhaps they should instead be compared to trading cards. After all, you're always getting something when you buy a pack of trading cards, and you likewise are always getting something when you buy a loot box in a video game. Well, ignoring for a minute that game publishers have a lot more control over loot boxes than trading card manufacturers have over their ability to distribute their cards, once again, you're mostly looking at superficial qualities. The same superficial qualities that cause loot boxes to not technically fall under the current legal definitions of gambling. At the end of the day, these superficial qualities are just that. Purely superficial. At the end of the day, what it boils down to is this. Loot boxes are now scientifically proven to be addictive. Trading cards are not scientifically proven to be addictive, at least not yet. I don't know how much simpler I can put this. I don't give a shit about your superficial traits. Loot boxes are addictive, and that's all there is to it. So go fuck yourself. This, ladies and gentlemen, is where we have to draw the line when it comes to microtransactions. The second people are duped into buying them without realizing they're buying them, the second their purchases become compulsory due to an addiction rather than voluntary. The sole justification that has been offered for so long by so many corporate executives for having these mechanics in the game is gone. Video game microtransactions, and especially loot boxes, are not optional. End of story. The only way these victims can truly avoid falling back into their addictive behavior is by avoiding games that have microtransactions in them altogether. Some may argue that, rather than government regulation, the proper response to microtransactions is full disclosure. Put a warning on the box art of the game so that people can see a game has microtransactions in them, and then simply walk away from those games if they want to. Everybody wins! Yay! Well, for starters, where exactly are we supposed to go get our fix of non-microtransaction games? If you insist on only buying games that don't have microtransactions, your options are becoming increasingly limited. As GameSpot writes, it is often more newsworthy when a game does not have microtransactions. But even barring that, in many cases, even that is an insufficient response. As Activision Blizzard has demonstrated, these warnings on the box art are effectively worthless because they can just add microtransactions to the game in a patch after the game has already come out and has already sold a bunch of copies. So I ask you, corporate apologists, what do you do if you're a microtransaction addict who is trying to actively avoid microtransactions in your game, so you go and buy Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled under the assumption that it didn't have loot boxes. So you bought the game, you got lulled into a false sense of security that your addiction was safe, and then BAM! The game ended up having microtransactions in the game after all. What do you do then? Do you call up Activision Blizzard and say, "Hey Activision Blizzard, this game has microtransactions in it and I specifically bought the game under the expectation that it wouldn't have them. Can I get a refund for this game, please?"
You serious?
In fact, Activision Blizzard's scummy attempts to sneak microtransactions into the game after launch sounds awfully similar to the backstory of a dungeon in the 2015 game Fallout 4. The backstory of Vault 95. For those of you who haven't played Fallout 4 and or didn't bother with the backstory of this dungeon because you just didn't care, it was originally set up as a drug rehab vault. Only drug addicts were granted admission to this vault. The vault was fully equipped with everything they needed to wean themselves off their drug addictions. Vault residents were encouraged to support each other in their rehab efforts, and it was all one big happy family. Until the day when a Vault Tech double agent had opened a wall in the vault and revealed a giant stash of drugs that had been hidden away behind the wall. Once people were once again within arm's reach of the drugs they were supposed to be avoiding, not only did their addictions come back full force, but they literally started killing each other to get to the drugs, hence why the skeletons are so littered across the floor. That was fictional. However, Activision Blizzard's addition of microtransactions into various games after the game was launched is very much real, and it is so shockingly similar to the backstory of Vault 95 that I have a hard time believing it wasn't directly inspired by it, or at the very least the two share a common inspiration. So you say that the best solution to the microtransaction problem is to simply not buy the game in the first place if you don't want microtransactions in your personal game collection? Well, even if you can still find some games you enjoy playing among the already dwindling selection of games available, that still isn't a viable option because you have no way of knowing what games are going to have microtransactions in the future. Unless you just trust a publisher's word that they won't be adding them, which... good luck with that. And at this point, there appears to be only one way out. If you don't want your children to inadvertently empty your bank account with microtransactions because they don't know any better, if you suffer from loot box or microtransaction addiction, which may or may not be the same thing as gambling or shopping addictions, and which may or may not be a distinction that I may or may not give a shit about, there appears to be only one thing you can do to truly avoid having your addictions preyed upon. You have to simply give up video games altogether. Or maybe not. There could be another way. The only way we can have video games that don't actively prey on people's addictions or children's innocence in order to squeeze every last penny they possibly can out of people is if we turn to government regulation of video games. 10 years ago, I would never have believed that I would be advocating for government regulation of the video game industry. However, back then, the only part about video games that the government had any interest in regulating was the violent content in the games, not the inescapable, and yes, inescapable, predatory spending of video game microtransactions. The biggest difference is that violence in video games has been repeatedly tested by scientists and repeatedly proven to have no noticeable impact on real-life violence, meaning that politicians were just making stuff up to use as a scapegoat. But here, microtransactions are proven to be harmful to otherwise perfectly healthy families. Loot boxes are proven to be addictive and harmful to players. The scientific evidence is in favor of government regulation. It wasn't a decade ago, but it is now. Therefore, just as a parent who doesn't want to hurt his child but must occasionally punish him, right now, the time has come to give the video game industry some tough love. So the question is, how exactly do we get this government regulation? We can rest assured that the AAA gaming industry will send lobbyists to Congress to either block the legislation or water it down to the point of it being virtually worthless as a means of curbing the abuses I have laid out today. More importantly, how do we structure this regulation so that it does not do more harm than good to the industry? We want to get rid of the toxic microtransactions and loot boxes that are touted as optional, but in practice are anything but optional, but we don't want ethical DLC like Far Harbor or the Burning Crusade to be inadvertently covered by this new law. Well, guess what? We don't actually need Congress on this one. At least in the USA, we can actually make our own laws and bypass the legislature altogether. Yeah, we actually can do that, believe it or not. I'll tell you all about it next time, so tune in next week when I'll discuss in detail how we can clean up the video game industry without needing Congress to do it for us. And the AAA gaming industry won't get a say in the matter. So until next time, I bid you all adieu. Acer Thorn out. Peace!